Of the Civil War exhibit. It's upstairs and it's great. I got to just sort of go through it very quickly, and it's worth seeing. Now, my focus here today are songs of the Irish and American Civil War, and it's my great privilege to go around the country and play these songs. And I do a lot of Irish festivals and historic sites, and especially at Irish festivals, people come to me and say, "Well, what are you doing here? What did the Irish have to do with this?" Well, they had a lot to do with it, and it had a lot to do with the Irish being accepted finally, because as many of you know, when the Irish arrived, beginning about the mid-1840s, we're talking about the famine Irish now, who were driven out of Ireland by the Great Hunger. They encountered a lot of hostility and prejudice. Placards that read, "No Irish need apply." Those were for real. They were all over the Northeast, especially in New York and Philadelphia, Boston. Not so much in the Midwest and Chicago, but they met with very heavy prejudice. So they had, at the beginning of the Civil War, they actually had two wars to win, one for acceptance as equal, loyal citizens of the United States, and then for the Union if they were in the northern side, and for the Southern independence if they were on the southern side. Now, most of the Irish, if you're from the South, I know people hate it when I have to say this, but most of the Irish were in the North, so most of the Irish were Yankees. I had to do this gig once in Savannah, Georgia, and boy, they didn't like that. That was fun, anyway. There were 160,000 plus Irish Yankees, and maybe as many as 200,000. And on the southern side, they estimate anywhere from 20 to 50 to 80,000, depending on who you ask. Some say even less than 20,000. So most of them were up here in the north. And what they did was, at the beginning of the war, they formed their own units. They had their own regiments. And in the Civil War, if you know anything about how they formed and fought the war, they formed in two ranks. And in the center of each regiment, there would be 10 companies to a regiment, and in the center would be the color company. And the color company carried the flags. Now, in most Union regiments were authorized to carry two flags. A U.S. flag, which was pretty much the same, stars and stripes, except it had 34. At the beginning of the war, 34 stars instead of the 50 that we have now. And they would be issued a blue regimental flag. This is blue, it had an eagle on it with the wings outstretched. A couple of red banners that would have the unit's designation written on it or painted. Sometimes they were oil painting on silk. And the Irish didn't carry that blue flag generally. They carried a green flag with the Irish harp painted on it or embroidered. They went into battle with that green flag flying, and they wanted to make sure they were recognized, not only by their enemies, but by their friends. Now, the Irish fought hard, and they fought well, and they were brave under fire. And I'm not here to tell you they were better than anyone else, but if you take any group of people and say, "You're not as good as the rest of us," they will fight to prove you're wrong. And this is true of the colored soldiers as well. The colored soldiers were put into their own units and treated very badly as well, almost as bad as the Irish. And they fought bravely too. I mean, anybody who fought against the colored soldiers or alongside them was impressed. And that was true of their enemies and their friends. So the Irish were in a similar condition. They weren't slaves certainly, but they were often just a heartbeat away from being slaves, because they'd come to this country, they were in abject poverty. They weren't educated. They weren't allowed an education. Irish Catholics in Ireland were not allowed an education. So they would come here with not much to start with. So they had their detractors, and those were called the Know-Nothings. That was a political sort of underground party that was totally anti-immigrant, anti-Irish Catholic. So they were fighting a lot of different political movements as well as the Civil War itself. But before I get into the songs, there are a couple of names that will pop up a lot as references in these songs. One is General Thomas Francis Maher. The other is Colonel Michael Corcoran, later to become Brigadier General Michael Corcoran. Now, Maher was a revolutionary back in Ireland. He was involved in the Young Irelander movement of 1848. It was a failed rebellion, one of the many in Ireland. He was caught with the rest of his conspirators, and he was tried and sentenced to be hanged. His sentence was somehow commuted, though, and he was sent to Tasmania, where he escaped a couple years later and came to New York. Now, he was kind of unusual. He was a son of a wealthy Irish Catholic merchant, so he had a lot of connections. Came to New York, was accepted to the bar, and became a big shot. Everybody knew him. He was famous already. And when the Civil War broke out, he did a lot to help recruit. The other was Colonel Michael Corcoran. Corcoran was another rebel or revolutionary back in Ireland, of a different sort though. He was what they called a revenue policeman. These were the guys who went around trying to bust all the moonshiners who were making illegal liquor for not paying taxes. So he did that by day, but by night he was part of a group called the Ribbon Men, and these were insurrectionists that went around creating mayhem artists, so to speak, creating havoc for the British. Well, he was found out too in 1848, so he had to leave. He was just about to be caught, so he made his way over to New York. And he joined the local militia, which became the 69th New York. Anybody heard of the 69th New York? The Fighting 69th, of course you have. That is still a regiment today. It's the oldest existing regiment in the U.S. Army to this day. It's National Guard. It was state militia right at the beginning of the Civil War. It started in 1851, but its origins go all the way back to the American Revolution, so it's considered the oldest regiment. And it was Irish for the longest time, up and through World War II. It's not Irish these days, but they remember their Irish roots. And every St. Patrick's Day, they lead the parade in New York City. And they still wear a sprig of green, like you see the sprig of green I got in my hat. They still adhere to those traditions. Now this, as you see, that's a sprig of boxwood. And I didn't put it there just to look more Irish, even though I think it does that pretty well. But it's there as part of the tradition of the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg, 1862. This was probably the worst military decision ever made. The Irish were sent up straight up a hill. It's called Marie's Heights. And at the top of that hill was a road cut in with a stone fence there, so it was a natural fortress. The rebels had four ranks packed into this road. They could just fire down on the Yankees as they came up, and it was like a machine gun. And they had men in the back loading muskets, because these were all muzzle-loading, single-shot muskets. Loading muskets and passing them, and they'd pass them back. So it was just continuous fire. The Irish Brigade went in with 1,200 men. They had 250 at the end that were left. But when that battle was over, the men who got closer to that wall were wearing the sprig of green. The reason that they had the sprig was because the flag that they had carried that whole year, all through the Peninsular Campaign, in Virginia, all the way through till the fall of that year. They were shredded. Their original flags, their U.S. flag and their green Irish flag, so they didn't have them with them. They had sent them back to New York, where a whole crew of these know-nothings, these anti-immigrant, prejudiced people, who had seen the Irish Brigade fight for a year, bravely, and they're just taking huge sacrifices. They actually turned around, they changed their mind, they raised money to buy the Irish Brigade a new set of colors, new set of flags, which are made by Tiffany's. Now we don't normally associate, Tiffany's with flags, but they made beautiful battle flags during the Civil War. Silk, either embroidered or hand-painted. In the case of these were embroidered. They had the Irish harp on them with a shamrock wreath and the sunburst. They were just gorgeous flags. If you look on the internet, you can find them. They're just, one of them, the one of the 69th New York, hangs at the Irish Parliament, the Dáil Éireann in Dublin. It was given by John F. Kennedy to the Irish people in 1963. So anyway, they had those flags and they were going to be recognized. They were sent up that hill, and they were, on that day, it was February 13th, December 13th. They were scheduled to receive those new set of colors. They were instead sent into the Battle of Fredericksburg, where they were just cut to pieces. So, not having green flags that day, General Maher and his staff rode around the neighborhood collecting all the boxwood that he could find and had them put in their caps. And that became their tradition. They wore it all through the end of the war. They wore it at the Grand Review at the end of the war, where they paraded in Washington, D.C., past all the politicians. And all the reunions later, they wore the sprig of green, and now the 69th New York still wears that sprig. But their favorite marching tune of the 69th New York and the Irish Brigade was one I'm fairly sure you'll recognize. It's still the theme and the anthem of the 69th New York to this day. It's called Gary On.